Kia ora, folks, and welcome to this episode, which is the second episode in my interview series, and I'm pleased to have Ron Crosby back in my house. And we're going to be chatting about Ron's latest book, Te Kooti's Last Foray. So, Ron, congratulations on producing this book. It's how many years has it taken to get this one?
Yeah, around about 3 years, I think.
3 years. Wow, that's a big project. So, tell me how it came about and a little bit about what was actually in the book.
Right. Well, probably if I start with that latter question first, it's essentially a tale of Te Kooti emerging from the Urewera, or the eastern Urewera, up in the headwaters of the Waioeka River, coming out to the coast at two communities of Ōpape and Ōmaramutu, which were two kāinga about 9 kilometres east of Portuguese. And there were 218 people in those locations, and he seized both of those communities. And they wouldn't have comprised many of the young fighting men because they were away with the Whanganui contingent. So it was basically older men and all the women and children. And there would have been hapu, there would have been pregnant women. You know, it was the whole of those two communities were taken back about 45 kilometres over a pretty tough walk into the headwaters of the Waioeka.
Tell me, why was he doing this?
Yeah, it's quite I'll try and keep it brief for this because it is long-winded, because he escapes from, he fights in 1865 alongside the Crown, gets falsely accused, gets imprisoned without trial, exiled to Foray, the Chatham Islands, record, and escapes from there. He's not tried, he's not sentenced, he's not given a finite sentence. He and 350 others who become his whakaro, his supporters.
Ron, this is back in 1865. This is 1870, mate.
That's right.
So,
3 years on the Chathams, and they escape, get attacked when they land, attack Gisborne, and then he kills as many Māori as Pākehā there. He's then besieged, gets away to Ngāti Ira, who are the people who are up the Waioeka River, the Whakatoria people, and they give him refuge. And from there he links with Tūhoi. He then goes across to the Māori king. He's rebuffed by the Māori king, and ends up back with the Whakatoria people. By that time he's been involved in a whole series of engagements. He's lost a lot of men, he needs ammunition, he needs weapons. So that's presumably what he's looking for. No one really knows. But the reality is that that's the assumption, that he was looking for support, both in terms of arms and in terms of people.
Okay.
So that's the background to the book. In terms of why I wrote it, when I wrote the Kupapa book back in 2015, there were accounts by two Whanganui rangatira, Te Kepita Rangihuanui, Major Kemp, and Tōpia Tūroa. They had written accounts of their release of the Whakatoria people. There was only one. Those reports were published in the appendices to the Journal and House of Representatives. But there was only one diary reported, and it was by a chap, Lieutenant Porter, who later became Colonel Porter. And I couldn't reconcile the two accounts. They just seemed, one was talking about a pa called Waipuna. Porter, who gave this detailed diarised account, didn't refer to Waipuna at all. Porter attributed the saving of the Whakatoria people and the recovery of them back to the Bay of Plenty to Ngāti Parau. The Whanganui claimed that they'd done it at a location called Waipuna. There was no map of Waipuna. When you looked at all the historical record, James Cowan right through to Dame Judith Binney, they all accepted Porter. Porter's account seemed to be correct. It seemed to be a diarised contemporary account. I was, like other historians, I think, compelled to accept that account, but I felt uneasy about it because it didn't fit with the Whanganui rangatira. A few years after I'd written that book, a book was written by a woman called Barbara Mabbott from Wellington, and it dealt with the diary of a chap called Samuel Austin, a Pākehā, who happened to be with the Whanganui contingent. And when you read that book, and then subsequently with her assistants got hold of the diaries and read the diaries, you realised that either Porter or Austin had to be correct. Both of them couldn't be. And as it transpired, over the next couple of years when we walked around in the doing some pretty long extended trips in the bush, we found that Austin's was absolutely accurate, and Porter's was just a nonsense. And but it's sad because he has captured the historical record for the last 150 years, and we needed to try and find Waipuna Pa, which the memory of which had been lost. And the reason for that was because the Whakatoia people were taken there, had to build their own accommodation, had to build their own pa, which was Waipuna. It was only occupied for 3 weeks before Whanganui attacked and took it and released them and took them back out to the coast. And they burnt Waipuna Pa. So it literally only existed for about 3 weeks. So memory of it, even in Maoridom, had been lost. And so even the locals didn't know where it was. And we believe, myself and my mates who walked it, and you walked within 500 metres of it with me, and when you droned over it, and we didn't know it was there, that location at that time. And so that was a big breakthrough to be able to recreate and re-establish where that was.
Tell me about how you found it.
Well, what threw me for a long time with Austin's diary was that he was giving very detailed distances. So we got to a certain location called the Three Rivers Junction, and you could work out where the Three Rivers were, and then it was 8 miles from there to this Waipuna Pa. We walked the 8 miles, so we measured all these distances on maps, etc. beforehand. We walked those 8 miles, and it took you, strangely enough, to a hut called Nico Flat Hut, which I'd been to back in 1987 when I was in the bush on my own for a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. And I knew that it couldn't be there. You couldn't have had a community of 300 people creating a pa at that location. It was too small. It was shale country, so the ground's shale. You couldn't have had a garden there. But more importantly, immediately on the northern side of Nico Flat Hut is a massive great ridge, and in winter just desperately cold. So it would not have been there, but we needed to prove the negative, so we needed to walk up there. So a companion and I, Chris Gray, who was an ex-CO of the SAS, we walked up there, and as we were walking up there, Chris said to me we should go over and have a look at the Te Pato stream, which was a stream that Te Kooti's wife and other supporters in their statements had said he favoured that stream because it gave him an access route to another area. And I talked to Chris about that, and he said we should go over there and have a look. And the pack was already feeling heavy to me, and I said, well, no, I don't think so. The river's flooded, we're not going to be able to cross. And he said, no, if you're writing a book about it, we should go. So we wandered over there, and it had been break feed for cattle. And I remember as I undid the break feed fence with the plastic holder, saying to Chris that, this is more break feed, this is mud feed. It was grazed right down to the soil, which was great because it took away the top cover. And as soon as we started walking out on that terrace, you're immediately walking through a series of patterned Foray excavation holes that were, to me, very obviously an old pa site. And so we took a series of photos, were highly excited. We'd found Waipuna Pa, etc. When we got up to the Nico Flat Hut, I was saying to Chris, the problem is, though, that's not 8 miles, And he said to me, well, what sort of chap was this bloke? And I said, well, he was an Imperial Army officer, Army NCO for 25 years. And Chris said, for heaven's sake, he would have been counting his steps. Officers required soldiers, and they still do in the infantry, to count their steps because even in modern times, if they have GPS denial, they need to know where they are on the map, and the way you do that is by counting your steps. And you count your steps out and back. So halve the distance, where does it take you? And when we got back home and we measured it on the map, it took you to exactly that location. Exactly. It's exactly 4 miles from the Three Rivers Junction. And so that was the real key. But when I got home, I said to my wife that we'd found it, and I was highly excited and showed her the photo. And she said, what, have you got any photos? And I said, yeah, I showed her the photos. And like all good supportive wives, she said to me, what was I going to do with those? And I said, well, I was going to put them in a book. It proved we found Waipuna Pa. And she said, well, it doesn't prove that to me. It just looks like a flat paddock. And because it was extremely
Being a
hard.
good critic, Ron.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it was extremely hard when you're on the ground to get a photo of a Foray depression. So I was pretty shattered. And the next day, a good friend of mine, Pete Anderson, called around and I told him this tale of woe, you see. And he said, well, have you got a photo from the air? And I said, well, I have, because about 6 months before, I'd flown over it with Mark Law in a helicopter, and Mark Law from Whakatane, and I'd asked him to drop the helicopter down while I took a photo up the Te Pātoro stream. And fortuitously, it had the spend in the river, in the photo. And so Pete said, oh, well, let's have a look at it. So I put that up on the screen, and he said, well, have you blown it up? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, oh, well, let's blow it up now. So I blew it up, and as we blew it up, the Foray sites all stood out. It also stood out with 3 lines off to the right that were really marked. And the next day, Dr. Ethel Anderson, the renowned New Zealand archaeologist who lives now in Blenheim, so I shot round and saw him with the memory stick. He put it in his computer on a big screen, told him the background, and I said to him, so enlarge it. And as he enlarged it, he physically sort of leant back in his seat and said, oh, this is a site of major Māori customary occupation. And when I inquired why he reacted that way, he said, well, particularly the Foray sites are very obvious, but he said those 3 garden areas, when they were making a pā, they would clear the stones from the site, use them then to demarcate. He said, we've never been able to work out whether they were demarcating between different whānau or hapu, or whether they were demarcating between different crops, but they used the lines of stones for demarcation lines. And so he showed me a number of his archaeological dig plans, etc., and they commonly had these lines. And so all of that really made it pretty plain that we had found that pā site. And that was a real seal on Austin's diary.
It made the whole book worthwhile, didn't it? I remember you sent me an email, very excited email, kind of virtually saying, check this photo out, and it was quite obvious. That photo, I presume, is in the book.
Yes, it is.
It's blown up.
Yeah.
And when you look where that place was, you think, this is a nice place to put it.
That's absolutely.
Lovely flat areas and right below the water, fresh water.
And with the Te Pātoro stream straight opposite, which he used to use as a route to higher up the Koranga River, which flows into the Waioeka. Yeah. No.
Now, I read Cohen's account, which goes off Porter, but there was Samuel Austin, who was the quartermaster for
the Foray,
and the other, and then Porter, who was a lieutenant, kind of second in command with Maraetahi. But then he talks about Thomas and Adamson.
Yes.
Who was a guide. And I'm thinking, there's another European. Was he embedded with either of the Ngāti Pā or the Whanganui?
Well, Cohen says that he was with the Whanganui contingent, and I don't think he was.
Right.
He's not mentioned in either Porter's diary or in Austin's diary. And then later, many years later, Austin was applying for a war pension or some support. He was in bad financial straits, and he wrote a petition to the government, which is in the archives. And in that petition, he says that he was the only Pākehā with the Whanganui contingent. So I don't think Thomas Adamson was, as Cowan says, I don't think he was part of that. He may have been may have formed part of the Whanganui contingent in other areas in South Taranaki, but he certainly wasn't on the Epuriki one.
Man, you've put a few things right in this book, Ron. Which is great.
Well, hopefully so. I mean, what irks a little is that as you drive through the Waioeka Gorge Road, there are some neat laybys that Waka Kooti, I imagine, has done, and with really good expressive interpretive signs. Yes. And the one close to Maraetahi Pā, which was the one that Ngāti Porou took, quotes Judith Binney's book. Now, Judith Binney, brilliant historian and wrote a brilliant history of Te Kooti and very accurate, except for this event. So she unfortunately took the Porter account, and that is now inscribed on the roadside sign. So everybody who stops at the roadside is told that 19 men were captured at Maraetahi, taken down to the edge of the river, and executed there, which just didn't occur.
That kind of is very similar to Ropata at Ngātapa. The same, where he captures a whole bunch, takes them up to Ngātapa and basically shoots them over the back. And, there's a lot of bad feeling or a lot of residual feeling amongst people for that. And similarly for this event at Maraetahi, they're sort of, this is a bit on the nose, whereas this one didn't actually even happen.
Well, no.
Not in the way that it's described.
Yeah. I mean, Porter's... you can actually demonstrate that, and in the book I do demonstrate it, that Porter, when he got out of the bush, handed in a letter of report to his senior officer in which he said they were fired on by a picket 2 kilometres down river from the Pā site. It took them 2 hours to get past that. By the time they got up to the Pā, and his words were, the enemy had gone. Well, clearly they would have gone. They'd been firing. They could hear the 2 hours.
His own words.
Yeah. So his own words said that when he first got out of the bush, his own words, but now they never got published. So that's in the archives. But what did get published later, about 8 weeks later, or he wrote it 8 weeks later, it was this diary which suggested that they got up there and all sorts of events occurred which didn't. And then 20 years later, he's converted into them killing the 20 beside the river at Maraetahi. Yeah. In fact, there were no prisoners taken at Maraetahi. There were nobody killed at Maraetahi. It all happened the day before, 14 kilometres further up the river, about 6 or 8 hours walk further up the river, when Whanganui attacked Waipuna Pa, took it, looked for Kiriopa and others who got away at the time for a day or so, and carried out an ambush of people who were fleeing from Maraetahi Pā. And then on the 2 days later, so the day after Maraetahi Pā was taken, they then walked down the river and joined up with Ngāti Porou. So the first time Ngāti Porou saw the Whakatoa prisoners, they'd been released. They were in the hands of Whanganui and had been walked down the river for about somewhere between 6 and 8 hours to get there.
Well, you having said that, this massacre on that side of the river never happened. There were about 6 villages that were attacked at night by Kemp as they made their way up I'll call it the Wairata Valley.
No, it's the Waioeka. It is the Waioeka Valley. So
that's the Waioeka Valley.
Yes, it is.
Okay,
yeah.
The Waioeka Valley heading towards Waipuna. They came across a number of little settlements where they captured people.
Whanganui, when they had arrived at Ohiwa Harbour, they'd come right across the island and then been taken by ship from Tauranga to Ohiwa. And the aim was, Maclean's aim as Minister of Defence and his orders really to Te Kepa, to Major Kemp, was to go up the Waimana River and attack Tūhoi. And Tamai Kōwha was about 45 kilometres up there at a location called Tauwhare Manukau. And they went up there and they had an exchange of shots with them, but they, much to Maclean's upset, because he hadn't authorised this, Kemp reached a peace, a truce with Tamai Kōwha, and so he then pulls back to Ohiwa, gets back on the 13th of March to hear that on the 7th of March, Kooti has come out and on 7th, 8th March taken the 2 communities at Ōpapi and Ōmaramutu and taken them back. And so he goes to Ōporiki. The river system at Ōporiki is Waioeka is the main one. Off to its east is a river called the Tutaitoko that flows into a river called the Otara, which flows and joins the Waioeka at Ōporiki itself. So they walk up the Otara into the Tutaitoko, following in the footsteps of Te Kooti, up onto a ridge called the Ropor Ridge, and they drop down into the Waioeka 45 kilometres up, and they're following Te Kooti. And now what Te Kooti had done when he got there was that he and his soldiers went downriver to Maraetahi Pā, and that's about 6 to 8 kilometres downriver. So they were downriver from what Austin called the Three Rivers Junction. He sent the Whakatoa and about 100 people who were imprisoning them, holding them, up the river to build their own power at Waipuna. So they went about 3 hours up there. In between, and probably to stop them, it was part of the method of containing them, there were about 6 temporary encampments, as you say, or puni, as they were called. And so they climbed a high point when they got to that point. They'd been walking all day. They'd got up at dawn. They'd been walking all day, arrived at that point at dawn, in dusk, climbed up a high point, he says, and got a view up to the south, up the Waioeka River, and saw the smoke from the campfires, etc. And that was at dark. So they carried on and attacked each. There was one power immediately below them.
Dark.
Yep. They attacked one power in the dark immediately below them, about a kilometre away from it. And you and I have looked at that power site. It's most impressive. They attacked that one and then attacked the 6 as they went on up through the night. And then at dawn, they arrived at Waipuna and they attacked. So they've been going 40 odd hours by now. Those attacks were all done pretty ruthlessly. It was with the killing was with the patiti, with the tomahawk, obviously to avoid sound of firing ahead, because they kept wondering where was the whakatoia, where were they, the prisoners. And when they finally got to Waipuna, that's where they were. So they took Waipuna.
This is at dawn.
At dawn. And they again, they killed 12 with the patiti again, and it wasn't until, I think it was either right near the end of that or later that day, they shot one man. And Austin says in the diary that was the first shot that was fired. So they, by that stage, captured 323 people, 218 of whom were the whakatoia, and they'd also killed probably about 20 or 15 to 20. The next day, they knew that Ngāti Porou were going to be coming up the Waioeka River, so they dropped down the river to the Three Rivers Junction, set on an ambush, and sure enough, through the course of that day, another 20 came up, 4 were killed, another 16 taken prisoner.
Because basically, when you say kill, it's not that they were executed, probably was a better word.
Well, who knows? Who knows?
Okay.
It's just, we're never going to know.
Right.
There will be assertions that they were executed. When the attacks occurred, they would have been rushing in to suppress people.
So it's not they were taken prisoner and then killed.
Well, they could have been.
Could have been, yeah.
Yep. Okay. At the ambush site, I think at the ambush site the next day, I think they probably were executed. But you don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mind you, by that stage, the New Zealand Wars was a brutal affair.
Oh, yeah, it was.
Brutal. There was very few prisoners being taken by
well, the reason why Ngāti Ira were living up at Maraetahi Pā under Hira Tupopo, their great rangatira, was because in 1865 the Pākehās invaded their country down at Oporiki because Faulkner had been killed there. So instead of going to look for the government going there and landing and trying to find who killed Faulkner, which would have been a few people involved in the hanging of Faulkner, they just attacked whakatoia. And Ngāti Ira were the ones who really suffered, and they, at Te Tarata, they suffered the last casualty.
How are Ngāti Ira and Whakatoia? They are
hapu of whakatoia. So, unfortunately, you can't work out who were the communities that were, like there are 6 hapu of whakatoia, but you can't work out which hapu were taken up the river, because it would have been a mix of probably Naitama, Hoa, Ngāti Rua, all the other hapu except for Upokarehi, who were held at a reserve at Ohiwa, but all the others were on a reserve at Ōpapia no Maramutu, and so they were mixed up, and they were just referred to in the records at the time as whakatoia, without any distinction. And so it's been, in the book, it's been a bit frustrating because I haven't been able to differentiate as to which hapu were taken up the river. But certainly Ngāti Ira you can identify, because after that terrible tragedy for them in 1865, Hira Tupopo, understandably, took them 45 kilometres up and created the Pā at Maraetahi. Huge gardens there. Porter.
So I was under the impression that Kooti basically established Maraetahi.
No. No. So what happened the night? Kooti was besieged after he attacked Gisborne, Turanganui. He was besieged at Maraetahi Pā, inland from Gisborne, and the night before he escaped, with a large number of men, escaped down vines down the bluffs of the northern side of Maraetahi. Messengers arrived from the head of Te Pōpō at Maraetahi saying, if you want refuge, come to us. And so that's what happened. When he escaped, he ended up days later down at Maraetahi. But he only stayed there about a month. Then he went over to the over to the Waimana, and entered that covenant with Tuoi, and Tuoi gave him their support from then on. So, Maraetahi was a refuge pā. It wasn't palisaded. Waipuna wasn't palisaded. Neither of them were palisaded, but they were both burnt by Whanganui, by Austin. Austin records that he was in control of the burning, and so they burnt the pā. And it's tragic, really, because it rained one night when they were at Waipuna for about 3 nights, and it rained one night, and he wrote that he took refuge in a whare. It was big enough. The phrase he used was that I had to pig in with 100 others in a whare. So huge. There must be a huge whare there. And we know from Porter's account that there was a big, huge whare karakia religious learning house that Te Kooti had asked for Ngāti Ira to build, and they did while he was doing his foray out to the west, out to the Kingitanga. When he came back, he opened the whare karakia just a matter of days before it was attacked by Ngāti Porou. And he described it as being over 80 foot long, 30 foot wide, 9 foot high at the eaves.
This was sawn planks, or was it?
No, it would have been
Foray
natural
style.
it would have been natural wood, and magnificent kia mats that covered the whole floor. It would have been huge.
Tell me a little bit about the rivalry between Ngāti Porou and the Whanganui contingent. Is there any interesting stories there?
Well, there is, and again, Porter's the source of a lot of it. Porter writes up there being a big raruraru when Ngāti Porou came over Mangapuatu, first non-Tuoi forced to pass through Mangapuatu, and they're up at Mangapuatu when they hear the news of the Rongopai, the peace that has been entered into with Tuoi by Te Kepa. So he reluctantly accepts that peace and acknowledges it and goes down the Waimana. And Porter's account later is that he has a big, huge argument and almost come to blows with Tamai Kōwha, Tauwhara Manukau. Didn't happen. And they didn't meet there because we know from other accounts that what happened was that when that Rongopai was entered into, it was so important to Tuoi. Tamai Kōwha himself headed for Ruatāuna in the middle of the Urewera, and he was either on his way to Ruatāuna or at Ruatāuna when Ngāti Porou went down the river. They get to Ohiwa and they meet Whanganui, and they hear the news of the abduction of these 2 communities. Righto, we're going to join together and go up and attack them. But they've just walked right down from Mangapuatu. They're pretty stuffed, and they've walked for days, they've walked weeks to get there, to get to Mangapuatu. So they're really suffering from sores. And
this is Ngāti Porou?
Ngāti Porou, yeah.
Ngāti Porou.
And Whanganui have walked across the island. They're not in much better shape either, but at least they've had a month at Ohiwa, so they're in a bit better shape. So Te Rangihiunui says, we'll go into a poriki tonight, wait for you in the morning, and we'll join together and work out what we're going to do, and head and land and attack them. And they know about Maraetahi, but they don't know about Waipuna at that stage. So they head off in the evening, and Ngāti Porou are recovering that evening before they go in the morning. Well, in fact, Kemp had no intention of waiting at Oporiki. As soon as he gets there at 10 o'clock that night, they head off. And so they follow up the Tutaitoko River. So they're off to the east of the Waioeka. In the morning, when Ropata gets there, they've gone. So they get food, etc., and they decide we're going to go up the Waioeka. They also get Whakatoria scouts. So they've got a couple of scouts with them. And guides, rather, not scouts, sorry, guides. So you've got 2 forces, one ahead of the other, with a major bush range between them, unable to communicate, and they're heading inland. And as I've described earlier, Whanganui get to Waipuna and attack it and release the Whakatoa. Ngāti Porou go up the river, don't have scouts out, get surprised by a picket of 2 men at a gorge called Te Kararo Tamatea, or now Hell's Gate Gorge, and they get held up there. They've got to drop back down the river, and we know that not from Porter's account. Porter doesn't mention that, but a chap, Tuta Niho, who was Ngāti Porou, he wrote a diary in which Cowan translated. But when you read the Māori, Cowan didn't translate the crucial sentence for the purposes of this book, because in that sentence he said, "Ka whakamuri mātou, we went back down the river, I taua, and whakawhiti I taua, they crossed over the river and then came back up," which they had to do to be able to fire down on the picket. And because when Te Kooti heard the firing of those 2 chaps, he sent another 20 down there to reinforce them. So they were facing quite a blocking force, and the photos show in the book how hard it is to get through that gorge. It's solid rock walls, etc. So they needed to be able to break through those guys. And so when they went, dropped back down the river, crossed back up, they were up higher and they were able to fire across. And that took 2 hours. But there was still 2 kilometres to go to get up. So
just getting back to the rivalry.
Yeah, the rivalry essentially was... It was
a race for glory, was it?
Well, who knows? They were in competition with each other. I wouldn't necessarily, they were out of communication with each other.
Mind you, was there a ransom on Te Koeti's head?
There was, but the intent, everybody knew that would be shared.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't think that was the driver. I think the driver was just competition.
Right.
We're not going to wait for you. We're going to head off, and we'll do the job.
The thing that amazes me is the fitness, the ruggedness, the absolute
toughness of Te Kooti.
Kooti. Well, he had to put up with that for years because these other ones could go away and.
Well, yeah, but they were tougher as well. We've just walked in their footsteps for relatively limited periods, 25 k's one day, 21 k's another, but up and over ranges, big ranges. In each case, I think one of the chaps had a fancy watch that recorded the altitude gain that we were involved in, and it was on each case 1350 metres. So if you think of people climbing up and over 1350 metres, this is men, women, children, and sure they had 3 days to do it, but massive effort that Te Kooti made these people walk to, and then when they got there, they had to build themselves their own accommodations.
They have to feed themselves, get themselves ready. Oh.
Well, he sent up food from Maraetahi Pā.
Oh, okay.
But that wasn't going to be a long-term solution. They were, in reality, I think the Whanganui did them a huge favour. I think they would have starved that following winter.
Because it was at the end of summer, isn't it? It's the end of summer.
It was the end of March. And there was no way they would have got a crop up. They would have been reliant on bush food and the gardens at Maraetahi. But if you have rain like we're experiencing now, the river comes up, you can't walk down the river. You can walk between the two overland. And I believe that's why Waipuna Pa was put on the side. Instead of being on the Te Papa side, I think it was built on the Maraetahi side so they could actually access food. But big walk, huge one, and carrying food supplies for 300 people from Maraetahi. I think they would have started,
Well, I think we might bring this to an end at the moment. So, again, how can people get hold of this book?
I think the retail price is $50 for it. And it's been illustrated by a friend of mine, Stu Spicer, who was with me on a number of the trips, and quite neat illustrations. And Stuart did a lot of the photography. The Kiwi Codgers had a good partner too.
So these will be in bookshops,
yes.
And you will be also, your website will be selling them as well, or
yes, it will.
Basically go through. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm.
Well, I'll put list to the down below. Very good, Ron.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Excellent.